Next we've got Melissa Walker from New South Wales DPI. And
thanks, Peter, and thanks everyone for sticking it out, nearly there. My talk today is around biosecurity communications. So I guess over the last few days we've seen a range of amazing talks, great technical detail, some real specialists out there. But broadly and commonly across all of our presentations we've seen, or a lot of them, there's been talk about being proactive, continuous improvement, and needing to communicate with our stakeholders about what it is that we're currently working on. And the first line of glow fouling partnerships, best management practices, it's a lot about communicating what those are to the stakeholders that need to know. So communication is the key. Someone definitely used that term earlier this week too. And we need to get buy-in from our stakeholders. In order to do that, we need to communicate well. We need to ensure that we get good compliance with any regulations that might be put in place. And again, communicating those clearly, what the expectations are from those stakeholders to achieve it. Getting behaviour change and accountability and ownership for people's own actions and the responsibility for biosecurity in protecting our marine and aquatic ecosystems from the impact of invasive marine species or diseases. One thing that comes up for me a lot is managing stakeholder expectations. So yes, I come from a regulator's space. I work for the New South Wales State Government, and managing stakeholder expectations in what we can and can't actually achieve out there in the environment is often a real challenge, and communicating those things well is where we need to be. Good communications can result in great relationships and building trust. So just as an example, in some of the work that we do, we communicate with audiences such as operational marine maintenance people, divers, but sometimes we get to things like the Easter show and we get to talk to groups of school kids. One of the things that's come back to us from a lot of these conversations with our community groups and stakeholders is that there isn't a great deal of understanding on what biosecurity is. So perhaps our messaging needs to be improved so that we can actually get a better understanding, even with some of that basic language we use all the time. So as I said, I work for the state government in New South Wales. I lead a small team of policy officers and we have one senior veterinary officer. We manage a range of issues from marine pests, freshwater pests and aquatic diseases. We've got one example there on the slide, bottom left, which is a pest fish, redfin perch to New South Wales, but it also, in this example, it is affected by epizootic ulcerative syndrome, so we've got a double whammy sometimes too. In New South Wales and probably many places in the world, the fact is once you have these pests or diseases in your environment, it's often too late to do much more than control and try and minimise spread. So prevention is the key. Regulations can sit there to prevent the management and minimise the risk of these things being transferred around, but without communicating to people on what their role is in managing that risk, we're actually not going to get very far. So we need to get that messaging right to elicit the right behaviours in our stakeholders. And that brings me to just an example in terms of communicating. In New South Wales for years, we've had a lot of pest incursions, we've had disease outbreaks, and we've had reactive creation of advisory tools, and we've got quite a lot. This is just a subsample of what we've got out there. Some of them have some great pictures and images. We've tried the catchy cartoons to get the attention of the kids and have people actually want to pick those things up. But we actually have never tested whether these communication materials meet the mark and actually achieve what we want from our stakeholder groups, which is to help us minimise those risks of things occurring in the first place. So in 2017, we embarked on a project. We actually had a project and a contract with a partner in Monash University and a group and an arm of their organisation called Behaviourworks. The purpose of this project was to actually identify how to best communicate with some of our key stakeholder groups in New South Wales. The project had 4 elements. We had an initial literature review, where there was a deep dive into existing understanding and knowledge of social research, behavioural drivers, and to achieve biosecurity outcomes. And then there was a communication tool review of our existing communication tools in New South Wales. And then we went to look to actually understand our audience better and did some stakeholder analysis with an initial and very targeted telephone interview and an online survey. The objectives, of course, to identify the best ways to communicate with our stakeholders, to see if we could actually determine some of the behavioural drivers for our aquatic stakeholders, and then to use those to develop some strategies for behaviour change in our messaging and how we approach that in New South Wales. One of the other objectives, and as an outcome of some of the knowledge that was already in the Monash group that we were working with, was to see if we could understand whether we had any subgroups in the aquatic stakeholder communities that may mean we need to adjust and adopt our communication style depending on those smaller groups within groups. So the first part, the literature review, was undertaken, and the purpose of that, again, was to think about the problem that we want and the question we wanted to answer, which is what are the behavioural drivers for our aquatic stakeholders to achieve the appropriate biosecurity actions to mitigate risk. What Monash partners did in this is they actually looked to identify the known drivers in that biosecurity literature that already existed, and then provided a list of what those drivers were for other terrestrial-based biosecurity social research outcomes, and adapt and adopt those for implementation in New South Wales. So with the outcomes of that literature review, we were then able to put that into practice with those subsequent steps of surveys that I'll talk about in a moment. The communication tool review. This is something we thought was really clever. We had a guy working for us for a little while who came with some fantastic wit, and he came up with this title, Make Clean Part of Your Routine, which we thought was really special at the time. There's others out there, come clean, go clean. You know, the catchier, the more fun it is, and perhaps the more easy it is for people to understand it. So this is one of the tools we decided to test. The communication tool review was done by 4 behavioural and social research scientists from Monash University, and they termed it affectionately a hackathon. So they basically just did a really short and sharp review into these 3 particular materials that we gave them from New South Wales that were already published. So what did we learn? We learnt that information like this, which is your publication number, what date it was published, completely irrelevant, off topic, nobody cares, and it needs to be moved to the bottom, or just not be on your publication at all. The other things that we found from this hackathon were that we really seem to have failed in a lot of our educational materials to target a specific audience well. We didn't have a lot of things in our materials that provided people with incentives. No one was driven to pick up our things. This style, the A4 with lots of words on it, just really not meeting the mark in terms of getting behavioural change from our stakeholder groups. And the thing that we had done a little bit towards in this one was making the headings relevant. So having really appropriate headings seemed to be an outcome and something that we had already started to understand, but we can always get it better and get it right next time. So the next part was the targeted telephone surveys that I mentioned before on the earlier screen. So this is about knowing your audience, and in particular Monash asked us to identify one behaviour in aquatic biosecurity that we wanted to drill down into. We only had limited resources, so we couldn't explore everything, unfortunately. But the one behaviour that we thought crossed over a lot of the work we do in pest and disease management was people washing their gear. So taking boats, gear out of the waterways, small boat users, small recreational vessel users, and the washing down the gear element was the behaviour that we wanted to explore. So a small group of 15 stakeholders across a range of demographics was targeted and selected specifically to have that broad demographic range to make sure that we limited any particular biases. And the outcomes are up on the slide there. So we actually found that people who do wash their gear already, from the understanding of this small audience, was just to keep it clean. They didn't understand that they were doing it for any other reason or that it had a flow-on positive effect for biosecurity. They made particular emphasis on, in our messaging, that we should be keeping our messages very simple and also keeping the behaviour requirement that we're trying to look for in our messaging simple and easy to achieve. The other one, the last point on the slide there, is maybe fairly obvious to most people. The people who have the most expensive gear are more likely to be the ones that do pull it out and wash it regularly and maintain it well. There's a lot of recreational users out there who perhaps don't have that same kind of attachment to their gear because it could be old or from fourth generations removed and not particularly worth them managing it quite so cleanly anymore. So that then flowed into our online survey. This was something that we really wanted to get a high number of respondents for, and we were pretty impressed with the numbers when we did get them back. It was a challenge. We had it out there for a number of months, and for anyone who's done online surveys using SurveyMonkeys, you'll try anything to get your numbers up. So we were posting our links on Facebook pages, our own staff were putting them on their personal pages. It was going all over the place, but we did end up with over 400 respondents, which was a really good outcome. What we were able to do with that data was to actually understand that we had 4 specific clusters of audience in that. So we had coastal boaters and fishers in one group, a distinct group of inland boaters and fishers, and then there was the more bay and inlet, not necessarily on vessels, fishers and fishing enthusiasts more generally as our 4 clusters. In terms of the behaviour that we asked them specifically about, we alluded to in the short targeted survey, the salt water or coastal fishers were washing their gear to keep it clean. They were pretty certain that that was going to result in the longevity and that maintenance was going to help them keep that gear for a lot longer. In contrast, our inland or freshwater fishing group that responded to that same question were really not that concerned about washing their gear. They were happy to pull it out, not wash it. It's in freshwater, what's the big deal? So there was certainly an attitude of why would we clean it? There's no corrosive impacts from the freshwater that it's just come out of. The other comments that we got through this survey were that there's been quite a big influence through our marine pest programs across the country in Australia where we have boat washdown bays. We have installed things for people to make it easier for them, whereas in our inland fishery regions, those kind of facilities don't exist. So that also came out of the survey. Of all of those 4 clusters, they all agreed, though, that they wanted to help protect the environment for future generations. So just, I haven't got it up on the slide, but one of the other outcomes of this survey too was, or one of the questions we asked was around the communication preferences. So, of course, when we're looking to get the best biosecurity outcomes through the right messaging, we also need to understand where and how we should be putting those messages out there. And the most popular avenues for those things were signs at boat ramps or marinas and popular access locations, signs in fishing or boating licence facilities, and then just information handed out when you're actually, doing transactions with boating facilities or fishing facilities or bait and tackle shops, for instance. So the outcome of this Monash project was really that we needed to be targeting our messages better. As I mentioned, the wreck fishers and boaters responded really well to having information put up at boat ramps, fishing and boating outlets and information centres or where you might get your boating licences. We need to be really careful about communicating and targeting those messages clearly and concentrating on positive behaviour outcomes that we're looking to achieve rather than excessive information on very wordy documents. And the main one that I think is useful for the audience here today, and we've heard it a few times, is thinking about the benefits. You know, what are the benefits and what's in it for me, for the stakeholder group that you're trying to elicit that behaviour change in. So just to summarise the take-home messages, you know, what is the biosecurity behaviour that we want to achieve? We need to understand our audiences in order to target the messages for that clearly and to understand how and where they might pick that message up, and target those messages really well to achieve the behaviour change that we're looking for. So what next? For New South Wales Government and the biosecurity group I work in particular, we're already partway through another project which is actually taking the outcomes of that Monash and DPI collaborative project into reviewing a whole suite of our advisory materials and adjusting the messages and tailoring them to target them better. So what about our national messaging? We've heard a lot about Commonwealth directions and being proactive. There's talk about policy at the Commonwealth level, and there's also the need for us as states and territories to work together on our messaging. So, you know, do our current materials meet the mark, and can we use the outcomes of our New South Wales project to improve things as we go into the future? I think we can. We've seen some of these before through some of my Commonwealth colleagues too. Our national biofouling guidelines, just as an example, one of them, I think the one in the middle, or one of them is about 47 pages anyway. I wonder whether we need some complementary materials that are developed that are a lot shorter and sharper and target those biosecurity behaviours for some of the audiences we try and reach with some of these documents. So in future, to achieve that best practice we're looking for biofouling management, in particular recreational vessels and small craft that are unlikely to be captured by regulation formally, we need to really target them with good biosecurity messages in our comms materials. We need to describe what behaviour we want them to do and not what to do. We need to understand the behavioural drivers of what is it that's actually going to make them do this. Is it fuel efficiencies? Is it about maintaining their gear for their kids? The gear lasts longer, greenhouse gas emissions for the larger vessels, and reduced maintenance costs is one, I think, for our yachty groups that perhaps we could really pull upon. Think about, for our materials that we have already, what's in and what's out. We heard yesterday with the industry stakeholder panel discussion around relevance and consistent language. So making sure that we have the right kind of language there for the audience and that it's consistent when we're talking about a whole country approach perhaps. And address those behavioural drivers, and in particular, the what's in it for me. Make people want to do it. So just again, those takeaway messages, I won't read through them again. And I'd just like to acknowledge we had a comms support team. I work in aquatic biosecurity. I'm definitely not a communications expert. And the project lead was Vic Greentree, one of my former team members who did a lot of that work with Monash. And of course, Bradley Georgensen from Monash University, Behaviourworks. So thanks for listening.